What really happened inside Sandringham House during that December weekend of 2000? For years, people have whispered about a private party hosted by Prince Andrew, a quiet evening that was supposed to be for close friends. But new details suggest it was anything but ordinary. Sources close to the palace now describe a fancy party costing more than £150,000, a night of champagne, expensive caviar, and the kind of guests who never make the official list. And at the center of it all were Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Staff working that night reportedly couldn't believe what they saw. One former housekeeper told a Sunday paper, Sandringham was never meant for this kind of party. It felt like a Hollywood after-party, not a royal estate. Another claimed the west wing of the house was sealed off. The cameras were shut down, and deliveries of alcohol continued long after midnight. By morning, the team discovered toiletries and unopened bottles of lubricant, packets of condoms, and small glass bottles labeled room scent, known to insiders as poppers. The guest list itself raised eyebrows. Andrew's friends from London's social scene mixed with Americans linked to Epstein's investment network. Ghislaine Maxwell, always playing hostess, reportedly arrived early to arrange the atmosphere. A palace source later said she was treated like she owned the place. Even Sarah Ferguson, the divorced from Andrew by then, was seen arriving briefly, signing off on a payment of around £30,000 to an events company tied to the evening. Fergie's friends insist she was there only for a quick hello, but others recall her handing envelopes to staff and leaving looking uncomfortable. One particularly disturbing detail has resurfaced from palace maintenance logs. The internal CCTV system on the West Corridor went offline at exactly 11:17 p.m. The failure was never explained. When asked later, the household's technical officer cited a temporary power problem. But as one former guard put it bluntly, power doesn't conveniently go out when the most controversial guests are in the building. Asterisk, why did this happen at Sandringham of all places, the Queen's beloved Christmas retreat? Analysts say Andrew was desperate to reinvent himself after leaving the Navy. Hosting financiers and celebrities offered a chance to build his own influence separate from his older brother Charles. According to royal correspondent Emma Frell, Andrew wanted to show he could be his own man, free from royal protocol, a modern prince who could mix with powerful people. But those ambitions collided with people whose reputations would later destroy him. By dawn, staff were uneasy. A handwritten report was quietly delivered to the duty officer in Windsor. Within hours, it reached the Queen's private secretary. She was told that inappropriate guests had been entertained at Sandringham and that security protocols had been broken. Insiders say Her Majesty read the note in silence, then closed the folder and said only one word, unacceptable. This wasn't the first time Andrew's social life had caused concern inside the palace. But it was the first time evidence of misconduct landed on the monarch's desk. According to a former equerry, there was no shouting, no visible anger. Just a long, heavy silence that everyone in the room felt. That silence would become the family's trademark response. No official comment, no public reprimand, just quiet containment, the Windsor way. Yet behind the walls of Buckingham, one question lingered. How much did the Queen truly know about the people her son had invited into her home? The morning after tonight, more than 2 decades later, that question still haunts the royal household. Because the Sandringham affair, as insiders now call it, didn't vanish. It left a trace, receipts, memos, missing footage, and a legacy of secrecy that the palace has fought to bury ever since. And according to one senior aide, there was never a cover-up. But there was a decision, a very deliberate one, to keep this within family walls. Whether that decision protected the monarchy or doomed it is what we'll explore next. The morning after the party, Sandringham felt eerily quiet. Staff who had worked the night before moved like ghosts through the halls, tidying up traces of a celebration that wasn't supposed to exist. The Queen's private secretary had already received a short typed report titled Incident West Wing. Sandringham Estate, according to a senior household source. The document reached Windsor by mid-morning on Christmas Eve 2000. Within hours, the Queen summoned her second son. That meeting has never been confirmed publicly. but multiple insiders who served the household at the time recall an unusually tense atmosphere that morning. One recalled, Andrew arrived in a hurry, pale, sweating. The Queen was waiting in her private sitting room, tea untouched. What followed, they said, wasn't an argument. It was quieter, sharper, and infinitely colder. She asked about the guest list. He told her it was a private networking evening. When she mentioned Epstein's name, he hesitated. He's just a businessman, mummy, nothing improper, Andrew reportedly replied. The Queen looked away, said nothing for several seconds, and then gave a simple instruction. You will not host that man again. And you will ensure this never reaches the press, a retired equerry later told a journalist. That's the Windsor style, discipline delivered without emotion, but her silence said everything. Behind the scenes, Buckingham Palace scrambled to contain the fallout. Edward Young, then Deputy Private Secretary, advised internal management, meaning no press, no paper trail, and no disciplinary action beyond a verbal warning. He reportedly told colleagues, there will be no scandal here. The public will never know, but others inside the palace weren't so calm. Princess Anne, ever the blunt one, is said to have confronted her brother directly during Christmas lunch that same week. According to a family friend, she told him, "You've made us all look like fools. This isn't Monaco. This is Mother's house." Prince Charles, by contrast, stayed silent in public but quietly instructed his own staff to limit shared appearances with the Duke of York. The cover-up against palace communications team worked overtime to erase traces of the night. Invoices were reclassified, staff were rotated, and the event contractor mysteriously folded 6 months later. According to documents later reviewed by reporters, the bill for Sandringham West Wing dinner of £30,000 was paid by a charity linked to Sarah Ferguson. Fergie's office denied wrongdoing, saying it was a simple catering error, but one former aide said the explanation never matched the numbers. Despite the Queen's order to end contact, Epstein's name kept reappearing in Andrew's calendar, private lunches, shooting weekends, and charity meetings. The Queen was aware, according to sources, but chose discretion. One senior courtier reflected years later, Her Majesty believed the press could forgive a foolish son, but not a broken monarchy. Her focus was on preservation, not punishment. Royal historians now see this as a turning point, the moment the institution chose silence over transparency. Dr. James Wright, an expert on royal crises, notes, it was post-Diana Britain. The Queen's instinct was to protect the crown at any cost. The trouble is, silence reads like complicity. Publicly, Christmas 2000 passed without a hint of scandal. The family walked to church at St. Mary Magdalene as usual. Cameras caught Andrew smiling, standing beside his mother as if nothing had happened. But inside the estate, the mood was strained. One member of staff described it as like performing for the world while everyone knows the lines have changed. Even the Queen's traditional Christmas broadcast that year, filmed only a few days later, carried a subtle shift in tone. Observers noticed her emphasis on personal responsibility and the duty to set an example. At the time, it seemed like a general reflection. In hindsight, many believe it was directed squarely at Andrew. And yet, no word ever left the palace, no admission. No reprimand, just the unspoken agreement that whatever had happened on the night of the 23rd would stay locked inside Sandringham's stone walls. The warning signs ignored still. The silence wasn't complete. According to an internal memo obtained years later by a royal biographer, a handwritten note was added to Andrew's private file in early 2001. Subject advised to maintain discretion in social engagements. Particular caution regarding American acquaintances. It was the palace's version of a warning label, but it came too late. Epstein continued to rise, his money, his connections, his influence spreading through both sides of the Atlantic. Andrew, flattered by proximity to power, saw no danger. And the Queen, bound by her lifelong instinct to shield the monarchy, hoped the problem would quietly fade. But palace insiders now admit that the seeds of disaster were planted that winter morning at Windsor. One recalled, if she'd acted then, if there had been consequences, none of what followed would have happened. But the Queen believed the crown survives by staying above the storm. She never imagined the storm would come from within. In the years to follow, that decision to contain rather than confront would return to haunt every member of the royal family. And as one former private secretary put it recently, the Queen knew more than she ever said. And sometimes silence can sound like approval. By early 2001, the story of that night at Sandringham should have faded quietly into royal folklore. One more whispered embarrassment tucked neatly behind palace walls. But then came the phone call that changed everything. A journalist from News of the World contacted the royal press office asking for comment on an unconfirmed report that Jeffrey Epstein attended a private event at Sandringham last December. Inside Buckingham Palace, panic spread faster than protocol. The call was logged, flagged, and immediately passed up the chain to Edward Young. His handwritten note to senior staff read simply, "Contain." No external acknowledgement. The press gets too close within 48 hours. The reporter received a letter from the palace's legal firm warning of potential defamation and reminding them of the strict laws governing trespass and privacy on royal grounds. The inquiry vanished, along with its source. The newsroom quietly dropped the story, though one editor later admitted, "We knew we'd hit a nerve." You don't get that kind of reaction unless you found something real. Behind closed doors, a damage control meeting was held at Buckingham. Andrew was there, as was Sarah Ferguson. According to a former aide, the mood was cold and transactional, no emotion, just logistics. The goal, eliminate the financial trail. The £30,000 invoice for Sandringham West Wing dinner was reissued under a new client name, York Children's Fund. The payment went through unnoticed. The company, Blue Ivy Events, dissolved 6 months later. When asked years later about her involvement, Fergie dismissed it as a misunderstanding. "I paid for catering, that's all," she told an interviewer. But others weren't convinced. One palace accountant recalled being instructed to neutralize inconsistencies in the estate's ledgers. "There was no doubt," he said. "We were told, don't ask questions, just balance the books." Inside the family, frustration was boiling. Princess and reportedly told confidants, "Every time he makes a mess, mother pays for the cleaner." Prince Charles, ever more cautious, began distancing himself from his brother publicly. A source close to Clarence House later said, Charles didn't need proof. He just knew the optics were poison, but the Queen refused to escalate. Her reasoning, according to senior courtiers, was brutally pragmatic. "If we deny it, we give it life," she said. "If we ignore it, it dies quietly." That approach worked for the Windsors for decades, until the internet changed the rules. Rumors that once evaporated now lingered online, mutating with every repost. And the name Jeffrey Epstein was fast becoming infamous. Still, the palace pressed on with its silence. Staff rotations were quietly implemented at Sandringham. Key witnesses were reassigned to Balmoral or Windsor. A security officer who questioned the camera outage at 11:17 p.m. was transferred to an overseas posting within the household. The words "the incident" became code for something not to be spoken aloud. The past resurfaced. The past has a habit of resurfacing. In 2010, when Epstein's arrest in Florida made global headlines, the dots began to connect again. Reporters dug into flight logs, party photos, and social circles. One image in particular, a smiling Andrew walking through Central Park with Epstein, reopened every wound the palace thought it had sealed. Suddenly, the forgotten whispers of Sandringham came roaring back. Tabloids began asking, was this friendship older than the public realized? The palace stuck to its old script, no comment. But this time, it didn't work. A veteran royal correspondent later said, the cover-up became the story. The silence looked like guilt. Behind the scenes, royal aides scrambled. One proposed releasing a short statement about the Duke's regret for past associations. It was drafted, reviewed, and then quietly shelved, blocked, insiders say, by the Queen herself. She wouldn't humiliate her son, says historian Dr. James Wright. To her, the monarchy was a family before it was an institution. She underestimated how much those two worlds had blurred. Meanwhile, Sarah Ferguson's finances crumbled. Facing debt and tabloid ridicule, She gave an interview claiming Epstein had once helped her financially, a revelation that only deepened the scandal. It was supposed to look innocent, says one PR advisor who worked with her. But it tied her even tighter to the same man Buckingham was desperate to erase. The irony, insiders now say, was cruel. Every attempt to suppress the story only added another layer of intrigue. It's like quicksand, one former communications officer explained. The harder we tried to bury it, the deeper we sank. For Prince Edward, the family's quiet observer, it was a turning point. He didn't say much, recalls a staffer, but everyone could tell he'd lost faith. He stopped defending Andrew in meetings. He just nodded when someone said the word disgrace. The illusion shatters by the end of 2010. The cover-up had achieved only one thing. It postponed the inevitable. Epstein's network was under scrutiny, and the Duke of York's name was already in the files. In hindsight, palace officials admit that the real mistake wasn't the party. It was the decision to protect it. A former senior courtier put it best: the monarchy survived wars, divorces, and death, but it never learned how to survive transparency. And while the Queen believed silence preserved the crown, that silence would soon cost her far more: her son's reputation, her own moral authority, and the public's trust in the very idea of royalty. 2010, the year the illusion shattered. Jeffrey Epstein, the mysterious financier once photographed beside billionaires and presidents, was now a convicted sex offender. And for the first time, the British press began connecting his name to Prince Andrew's, tracing a web that led straight back to Sandringham. Photos from New York showed Andrew walking through Central Park with Epstein just months after the American was released from prison. The images were damning: the smiling Duke of York, hands in pockets, chatting casually with a man the world now knew as a predator. It was the moment Buckingham Palace realized denial wasn't going to cut it anymore, says royal correspondent Emma Farrell. You can't claim ignorance when there's a camera in your face. Inside the palace, aides scrambled to craft a narrative that Andrew had merely been tying up loose ends, ending an old friendship out of courtesy. But those who knew the Duke's social habits weren't convinced. He thought he was untouchable, says a former staff member. He believed rank protected him. That being the Queen's son-meant scandal would always pass him by. The evidence mounts, and yet this time, the scandal had a global reach. In America, journalists were unearthing Epstein's black book, a contact list filled with names of the rich, the famous, and one marked Duke of York. Investigators discovered that Andrew had stayed in Epstein's Manhattan mansion, a property worth more than $70 million. Now infamous for its hidden cameras and underage visitors. Witnesses recalled seeing a British VIP at several gatherings hosted by Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell between 2000 and 2003. One of them, Virginia Giuffre, later claimed she had been trafficked to Andrew as a teenager, a claim he has always vehemently denied. But the visual evidence kept mounting: flight logs, photographs, messages. Each new revelation pulled the royal family further into the vortex. Back in London, palace officials were in crisis mode. Aides debated whether Andrew should step back temporarily from public duties. But according to insiders, the Queen resisted the idea. She wanted facts, not headlines, says a former private secretary. Her view was, you don't punish on gossip. Charles, however, saw things differently. His relationship with his brother had long been strained, and now he feared Andrew could taint the monarchy itself. Charles understood what the Queen didn't, says biographer Robert Lacey. He knew the media storm wouldn't pass. It would grow. Behind palace doors, a subtle power struggle began. Charles pushed for reform and supported him quietly. But the Queen, loyal to her bloodline, chose caution. She's always believed family comes before institution, notes one courtier. But the cost of that belief was about to explode. By the end of 2010, public sympathy had evaporated. The tabloids dubbed Andrew Air Miles Andy, mocking his jet-setting lifestyle funded by questionable associates. One headline simply read the Queen's embarrassment. Donations from corporate sponsors were withdrawn. Charities began declining royal patronage. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, recalls one former aide. You could see the impact coming and no one hit the brakes. The breaking point, then came the breaking point. A leaked email from Ghislaine Maxwell to a mutual contact described Andrew as a loyal friend to Jeff, always generous with introductions. The email, published by The Times, was the spark that turned speculation into confirmation. That line, loyal friend, killed the palace's defense, says investigative reporter Julian Knight. You can't claim casual acquaintance when your co-conspirator calls you loyal. In private, the Queen was said to be deeply unsettled. She still refused to believe her son guilty of anything criminal, but she could no longer ignore the reputational damage. As senior courtier remembers her words, one never expects to choose between a child and the crown, Sarah Ferguson. Meanwhile, tried to steady the ship, publicly praising her ex-husband's good heart, privately begging friends for introductions to PR fixers. But her own connection to Epstein, including reports that she had accepted financial help from him, turned her into collateral damage. Every move she made dragged them both further under, says a royal watcher. And still, Andrew refused to step back. He continued to represent trade delegations abroad, insisting privately that the British people know my integrity. But polling told another story. A majority now viewed him as a liability. The monarchy's approval ratings began to dip for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The Queen's advisors urged her to contain the fallout before it spread to the institution itself. Their solution: silence, no interviews, no rebuttals, no apologies. They thought ignoring it would starve the story of oxygen, says historian Dr. Wright. Instead, it suffocated their credibility. By the spring of 2011, palace staff had coined a grim nickname for the situation: the American Shadow. It followed Andrew everywhere, at charity galas, trade visits, even family photographs. Behind every polite smile was the unspoken question: what really happened that night at Sandringham? A different kind of stormed monarchy had faced storms before, but this one, insiders say, felt different. It wasn't about politics, or divorce, or death. It was about corruption, about what happens when privilege meets impunity. And as one former equerry put it later, for the first time, people didn't just doubt a prince. They doubted the palace itself. In the years that followed, those doubts would harden into something far more dangerous: a public reckoning that would expose not only Andrew but the fragile foundation of royal accountability. The era of quiet cover-ups was ending. The era of consequences was about to begin. November 2019, the Duke of York walked into the BBC studios believing he could explain it all away. For months, his name had been dragged through headlines across the world, accused, ridiculed, isolated. His team had promised this interview would set the record straight. What unfolded instead was one of the most catastrophic moments in modern royal history. The Newsnight conversation began politely enough. Then came the questions no amount of rehearsal could soften. Did he regret his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein? Did he sleep with Virginia Giuffre? Why had he stayed in a convicted sex offender's mansion? Andrew's answers were astonishingly tone-deaf. I don't recall ever meeting this lady, he said. I was at a Pizza Express that evening. He insisted he couldn't sweat due to a medical condition. The excuses bordered on surreal. Within hours, social media exploded. It wasn't just bad, said one former royal correspondent. It was the Titanic of interviews, and Andrew was steering. Clips went viral overnight. Headlines screamed no sweat, no regret, and disaster Duke. Even loyal courtiers couldn't defend what they'd seen. Aides who had sat in the control room described a deathly silence as the broadcast ended. We all knew, one of them said. That was the end of his public life. End of chapter. The fallout within 48 hours. Charities began severing ties. Universities, hospitals, and military units announced they would no longer accept his patronage. Corporate sponsors withdrew support from royal foundations. It was a chain reaction, said a crisis management expert. One institution after another saying, we can't afford to be associated with him. Behind Buckingham's gilded doors, the Queen faced the unthinkable. choosing between maternal loyalty and institutional survival. Sources close to the palace described her mood as grave, determined, and heartbroken. On the morning of November 20th, she summoned her son to Windsor for what insiders later called the quiet execution. There was no shouting, just finality. The statement released that afternoon was short and brutal, with the Queen's permission. The Duke of York will step back from public duties for the foreseeable future, but the internal decision went much further. He was told to cease all official appearances, to close his private office at Buckingham Palace, and to withdraw from trade work abroad. Behind the scenes, courtiers debated whether to strip him of military titles. The Queen hesitated for the moment. Then in January 2022, as the civil case in America advanced and Giuffre's lawyers prepared for trial, the palace issued another notice. The Duke of York's military affiliations and royal patronages have been returned to Her Majesty. He will continue not to undertake any public duties and is defending this case as a private citizen. It was the clearest signal yet. The monarchy had cut him loose. Historians called it a constitutional amputation. For the first time in modern memory, a senior royal had been publicly stripped of titles while the sovereign still lived. It was the Queen's hardest decision, said biographer Robert Lacey, but she understood that the monarchy could survive a scandal. Not a cover-up, the exile in the aftermath. Andrew vanished from public life. His official website went offline. His security team was reduced. Reports suggest he became increasingly reclusive at Royal Lodge, the estate he shared with Sarah Ferguson. He walks the gardens alone, said one neighbor. He still insists he's been wronged, that it's all unfair. The damage, however, was irreversible. Polls showed public trust in the royal family had dipped to its lowest point since the days after Princess Diana's death. For the first time, more than half of Britons believed the monarchy should reduce its public role. It wasn't just about Andrew, explained commentator Emma Farrell. It was about accountability. If a prince can't face consequences, what hope is there for anyone else? Through it all, the Queen maintained her silence. In private, she reportedly told a confidant, "One must do one's duty, even when the duty is unbearable." And so, with a few carefully chosen words and a stroke of her pen, Elizabeth II ended her son's royal career, not with fury, but with sorrow. The Duke of York was now just Andrew Windsor, a man stripped of everything except his name. But even as the palace tried to draw a line under the affair, new documents were surfacing overseas, files hinting at flights, parties, and payments that tied the story back to where it all began, Sandringham. 11:17 p.m. The scandal was supposed to be over. In truth, it had only changed shape. By the time King Charles took the throne in 2022, the Duke of York had already become the family's unspoken shadow. The Queen was gone, and with her, the only shield that had ever truly protected him. In the months that followed her funeral, Charles moved quickly to reset the monarchy's image. His message was blunt. There will be no way back. Charles takes action. Nearly in 2023, Andrew's security funding was withdrawn. His taxpayer allowance, roughly £240,000 a year, was quietly ended. By that summer, reports surfaced that the king wanted him out of Royal Lodge, the sprawling Windsor estate Andrew had occupied for decades. "He's being squeezed out inch by inch," said one former courtier. Charles isn't cruel. He's clinical. Publicly, the palace maintained that the Duke was living privately. Aides referred to him as the ghost. He appeared at no official engagements, wore no uniform, and no longer used the title His Royal Highness, even during trooping the color. The annual parade that once celebrated the Queen's birthday, he was absent from the balcony. For the first time in modern history, a living son of a monarch had been erased from the royal stage. In 2024, new light flickered on the old scandal, the Epstein files. Phase 2 hearings in Washington released thousands of documents. Among them, a flight manifest listing York inbound Sandringham. One witness statement described Epstein boasting about a Christmas gift to the British royals. Buckingham Palace declined to comment, but the internet did not. Conspiracy forums reignited. Investigative podcasts dedicated whole seasons to the Sandringham affair. And royal watchers once again asked, what happened at 11:17 p.m.? The unanswered questions kept the story alive. And in the age of digital permanence, silence was no longer a strategy. Sarah Ferguson published a memoir that skirted the subject. Writing vaguely about the price of loyalty, Princess Anne, asked about her brother during an engagement in Balmoral, replied curtly, "Some things are personal, but every family must live with its own history. The relic Andrew himself remains out of sight. Those close to him say he spends long hours walking the grounds of Royal Lodge, still insisting he's been unfairly treated, still hoping for redemption that will never come. He doesn't grasp that it's over," one aide admitted. The monarchy has moved on. He's a relic from a time when secrets stayed buried, and yet the legacy lingers. The Sandringham incident, that night of December 2000, has become a symbol of everything the royal family once refused to confront: privilege, denial, and the dangerous comfort of silence. Today, King Charles and the Prince of Wales present a new face of transparency. One that vows never again, but behind the glittering facade of reform. A simple truth remains: the crown survived not because it was flawless, but because it learned painfully how much truth it could no longer hide. The cameras that went dark at 11:17 p.m. have never been accounted for. The files marked Sandringham incident remain sealed in the royal archives. And as Britain looks ahead to its next generation of monarchs, one question still hangs in the cold Norfolk air: what exactly happened that night? Thank you for watching. If you want to stay ahead of the stories Buckingham Palace hopes you'll forget, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications, because the next royal secret might already be unfolding.